This episode of The Edge is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek.fm at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
Hey, this is Jeff Russo. I'm the composer from Star Trek Discovery, and you're listening to Trek FM.
What have you done out there on the edge of Federation space?
Welcome, listeners, to another episode of The Edge, Trek FM's dedicated podcast to Star Trek Discovery. I'm your host, Amy Nelson, and with me this week, as he always is, wonderful Patrick Devlin. Patrick, how are you doing this week?
Yeah, I'm good.
I know.
We'll just tell everyone I'm good.
Loaded question.
It's been a rough one.
You're here, right?
Yeah, I woke up this morning, so that's a plus, right? So,
Yes.
School finally ended this week, and I got all that paperwork done. That was good. And so now my summer should open up, but it won't.
Yeah. I'm in the middle of my summer vacation, totally feeling it. For the first time, I had an absolute lazy day and I didn't do anything. Well, I went to the gym, but outside of that, lazy day, and it felt so good.
Can you tell me what one of those is like? I haven't had one in over 10 years.
Right? They're few and far between, but I do try and get one every summer, and I had it.
I thought I was going to get one, and then last Friday we decided to redo my son's room.
I know. I was so surprised when I saw the pictures, and I was like, what's he doing?
I spackled. I skim coated every wall, and we bought all new furniture, and my wife painted every wall after I skim coated every wall and sanded, and then skim coated again and sanded.
I mean, you had just finished your kitchen and your living room, and that was a huge, major project, and your backyard.
Yep.
And so I thought, all right, Patrick's going to get to enjoy, and then nope, wifey comes up with the honeydew.
Yep. And while we speak, in the other room, I'm doing laundry, so.
Oh, your wife is so awesome. I love her.
Yeah, at least someone does.
Well, hey, listen, today we are privileged to have Bryan Melash. He is an associate producer of The Edge. Welcome, Brian, to The Edge.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's my privilege to be here. It's I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I listen to you guys every episode you guys have, even when I have my own.
Yeah, you are very devoted to Discovery.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Always posting when I read on postcards. So very appreciative there.
Best episode that there's ever been. Yeah, I know. Sometimes when I'm in the moment, sometimes the thing after my emotions kind of like settle down a little bit, I can more analytically look at it. And I've certainly done that now with both seasons of Discovery, but I absolutely do love the show very deeply. It is come at a time in my life when I've had all sorts of tumultuous things going on. I lost my job in between seasons, moved from Ohio to Florida, started a new job, and all the way through it, I've been also podcasting about it. So I just absolutely love the show. It has been so unexpectedly good, and I love it. But at the same time, I can criticize it, and we'll certainly be criticizing it a little bit this time out.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've been on the network before. We had you on Earl Grey. You also participate in the Patrons Roundtable, but this is the first time officially on the Edge main show. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about how you found the network, especially since you already do your own podcast?
Well, I found it prior to doing my own podcast, I found it, I think, around the time I think Discovery was announced. So in late 2015, I started picking up shows on the network. And of course, The Edge started before I started my own podcast, which I had bought the domain for it, which the name of my podcast is the Star Trek Discovery Podcast. Nice and easy to remember. And I bought that Star Trek Discovery Podcast.com, but looked around for a while to figure out where I was going to host it and that. And I had already done a podcast on The Walking Dead on the Golden Spiral Media Network. So we ended up there, and we've been going since the beginning. I had one host, Adam, who used to work with. He left after the first half season, and I transitioned right into my former host on The Walking Dead Talk Through, which is Ruthie. And she loves the show as much as I do. And we do that podcast as well. We have a roundtable that should be coming out around the time of this episode. But I have been into Star Trek ever since I can remember. I'm 52, so I think I discovered Star Trek back when it was in syndication, and then when the animated series came out. And I've pretty much been into Trek the entire time that I've been alive. I was born during season 1 of TOS, so it's been a part of my life from the beginning. And like you, Amy, I'm definitely a next generation person. I started trying to, I was into it so much that I started trying to sell, to write a story for it. So I actually submitted 2 scripts to Next Generation. I didn't get any of them purchased, but it did give me a chance to pitch to them. And I came very close, Amy, to selling the last story that was purchased for Next Gen. It ended up being, it would have been the episode that what it ended up being was Preemptive Strike, which was the final Ensign Rowe episode. It would have been in that slot, but I continued to pitch, and later that year I pitched a story that was eventually bought and became the basis, or part of the basis, of Deep Space Nine season 4 episode 26, Broken Link. The part of the story, and I should mention to listeners, you will not see my name on the credits. Unfortunately, all they did was they bought my story idea, gave me a nice little letter and $500 and said, thank you. And, that was enough. But anyway, the part where Odo gets sick and the only way he can be saved is for Bashir to take him back to the Founders, that was in the story that I pitched to them. And that was combined with another story from George Brozak, and that became Broken Link. And I pitched to Deep Space Nine several times, Voyager several times, came close a couple of times, but it was only that one that ever, got sold. After that, as Enterprise went on, my life had kind of changed. I moved away from Canada. I'm originally from Windsor, Ontario. And I was pitching most of that time when I was living in Toronto, but I moved to the States. And as Enterprise came on, I kind of, my fandom kind of wavered a little bit. And then certainly when it was canceled, it kind of went into a dormant period. And I think it got reignited with the announcement of Discovery. And it's pretty much been back ever since. So, that's it for me. But I thank you for the opportunity to talk like a topic base, which on my podcast we don't do. So.
Yeah. Well, talking about the topic, when we invited you on, we asked you if you had some ideas, and you sent over a plethora of ideas.
27.
Yes, I'm sure we will be covering them throughout. But one that I felt was intriguing was you wanted to talk about specifically the Sarek and Amanda Grayson family.
Right.
So what about that, how did you even get this idea for a topic? What was the germane there?
Well, I think it comes back from the very announcement of the Michael Burnham character, when it was explained that Michael Burnham was Spock's foster brother. And I, like a lot of fans, was very reluctant and I was very reserved about that announcement and thought, why would they do that? And, suddenly they've opened up, discussion for the haters, and we all know that this show has its share of haters, which are wrong, but that's besides the point.
Yes.
And
no, he said haters.
Yeah.
Clearly, I'm always putting that in that conversation.
You're not a hater. You are you are a person who critiques the show and doesn't give it any quarter. But you
I agree.
You still love the show.
The listener doesn't.
No, I know, but this is I'm telling this to listeners, so I'm like trying to set them straight. Look, Patrick is not a hater. I support you, Patrick. So what he does and what I do on my own podcast, and believe me, I absolutely adore this show. I love it so much. I cannot even I'll probably cry a couple times. I'll be like Brandy on the live show. I love this show so much, but this is not the show I would have designed if I was coming back with a new Star Trek. So one of the things that I really had an issue with at first was this whole Burnham is a part of Sarek's family. Why would they do this? And I have been pleasantly surprised over the last 2 seasons as it has unraveled and we see all the dynamics it's brought, what it has added to canon, added to the flavor and the nuances of Star Trek in general, because you've actually made more dimension to this iconic character of Spock that I think, like a lot of viewers of Star Trek, never really realized that we needed. But now that it's here, it's like, oh my God, it's made it so much richer and a much deeper story than I realized.
All right. So let's get to the members of the family. We obviously have Sarek and his wife, the human, Amanda Grayson. Mm-hmm. They had Spock. And then Michael comes into the story as the foster and under their ward. And then Sybok, not to forget him, he was actually Sarek, so a stepbrother,
right, or
a foster stepbrother to Michael. However, hasn't been mentioned in Discovery, but Sybok was from Sarek's previous marriage, or was it just a previous relationship? Do we know?
In researching this, supposedly it was mentioned, I think, in the TNG episode, I think, of Sarek, that he was only married twice. So we had Perrin, of course, from TNG, and we have Amanda. So this other, child, I'm guessing must have been born out of wedlock. We know that she was supposedly a Vulcan high priestess. Whether he was raised with Spock or not as part of that family, I don't think we know. But when you think about Sybok and how he fits into this, and I'll get into that later, I wonder if he maybe was under that roof and just was old enough that he was not in the mix when Michael joined the family. So, but we'll go more into that later.
Well, yeah. So what is do we know? I was just going to look it up, but I'll just ask you because you might know. what is the age difference between Spock and Sybok?
I wasn't able to determine that exactly. I know that in Star Trek V, it is presented that he was older, but I believe in real life, Lawrence Luckenbill was actually younger than Leonard Nimoy, but I believe he was playing it older than Spock. So I don't know his exact age.
Yeah, because Sybok is definitely meant to be older.
Right. I mean, obviously, unless Sarek, had an extramarital affair, Sybok was obviously born before he and Amanda were a thing. So he's obviously older, but how much older, I'm not sure. My ballpark guess was maybe somewhere in the 10 to 15 years, but I don't know. I couldn't find anything specific on that.
Yeah. Okay. And so you don't think then that Michael and Sybok were in the house at the same time?
I think that she probably knows of Sybok, but I don't believe that when she came to live there that Sybok was living there. I figure if I had my own headcanon, and by the way, I hate that term. I hate it. I would rather speculate. I'd rather speculate and say that I'm guessing that Sybok was probably off at the Vulcan Science Academy at the time. The one thing that we know about Sybok was that he rejected logic and embraced emotion. And I'm thinking that happened at some point while he was in his study. So probably near the end of his time at the Vulcan Science Academy. We don't know. I'm looking to see if there's any mention of him at the Vulcan Science Academy. I don't see it, but I believe that Spock had mentioned that, he had basically just had rejected logic at some point. So
see, now in my head, I saw it as he never even ended up there. And I feel that the episode where Michael keeps getting thrown out of Sarek's thoughts when he's feeling bad about trading them off for the Silence Vulcan Academy.
Right.
I feel like that supports the fact that Sybok wasn't even considered to go there.
Well, my theory was that perhaps the reason why they kind of put Sarek through the ringer might have been because of Sybok, but I don't have any evidence to support it. But I do have evidence from conjecture, I guess, like the way that Sybok is, I think plays into it. The fact that you could call him the laughing Vulcan. So he is a Vulcan that has rejected this not expressing emotions kind of thing. And I wonder, when you think of him and Michael and Spock, I see a pattern there with emotion and the human qualities and stuff like that. And I wonder, and this is kind of the whole thing that I was coming up with, is that I believe Sarek was experimenting with his 3 kids, that he was experimenting with the use of emotion and the ability to maybe create the perfect Vulcan. Like, I'm thinking that he admired humanity and he thought that maybe Vulcans lost something. He certainly doesn't like the logic extremists, which I think, by the way, logic extremism is by its definition illogical. but that I'm wondering if he was experimenting to try to create the perfect Vulcan. And we have our 3 examples. This Sybok, who basically rejected logic, or maybe not rejected logic, but embraced emotion. You have the half Vulcan, half human Spock, who was going through his own difficulties with emotions. And I think that Sarek obviously took different conclusions than were actually the case as far as why Spock had as many problems as he did. And then we have Burnham, who he tried a human to be raised in the Vulcan, in the Vulcan disciplines. But as human, she's someone who would have more control over her emotions than a Vulcan does. So that's what I'm thinking is that it just reeks of Sarek doing experimental parenting with these three kids.
Well, you mentioned Sybok already, so let's talk a little bit more about Spock and why you think it was experimental. So this one, I think, would be the most interesting case where we've got a half Vulcan, half human, so it's interesting to see the gradation of, 100% Vulcan, half and half, and then 100% human. So let's talk a little bit more about Spock.
Hold on one second, though, before we jump that far. I don't know necessarily if he was experimenting or if what happened with Sybok caused him to push back the other way too hard.
Yeah.
Because you remember, we hear that Amanda wasn't allowed to have much influence on Michael or on Spock. And I feel like that's because he blamed her for Sybok's way of turning out, possibly. Not that I'm completely saying there was no chance of it being an experiment, just that, that's just how it seemed to be presented to me in general. But I don't know. I never really gave it much thought before you brought it up. So
yeah. I that's a good insight, Patrick. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he blamed her for that, because he does blame Amanda for for example, using the Alice in Wonderland book and how that kind of bringing in chaos and stuff like that. And, that's discussed, I think, in Light and Shadows. But this whole thing that I think with Spock, first of all, Sarek did not realize that this, was it Latak? Is it Latak Terai? I think it's what it's called. The Vulcan dyslexia. He did not realize that the Vulcans weren't the ones that treated him. It was Amanda that treated him to be able to cope with it. And that she was not allowed to express emotion with Spock. Now, whether or not that was true all through his upbringing, or maybe just after Amanda joined, I don't know. That's not really talked about. But certainly there was definitely some conflict there and some pain and some sacrifices that Amanda had to make for not giving Spock the love that he needed and the support that he needed. It seemed like she thought that she was very distant to him. I don't know if that's the case. She might have been kind of hard on herself, but that's neither here nor there.
I feel like Amanda, in raising her own child, Spock, that she felt like she had to walk on eggshells a little bit. That, she was, I don't know if she was specifically hiding the fact that she was, reading to Spock and Michael, the Alice in Wonderland, or, that she was helping him cope with the dyslexia. But the fact that Sarek didn't know about it sort of hints at maybe that she was hiding her parenting so that, Sarek wouldn't come down on her and say, I want to do things my way. Mm-hmm. It seems a little separate.
Right.
And it's not a united front, which is interesting, because I think when, she has that feeling with Spock, and then when Michael comes in, Like she was just willing to give all of her emotions in part because she knew that she was 100% human. Mm. But, you know, that she had more freedom because it wasn't Sarek's blood child.
Maybe that's the case. Certainly.
It's possible. Sorry. But it's possible. Also, it's just that he's so busy that he's kind of being an absentee dad too much.
Right.
That she's doing these things. She might know he doesn't want it, but tough, you're not home.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to raise them the way I want to raise them while you're not home. I mean, I don't think there's nothing I can point to that says that. There's no evidence to say that exactly, but there's no evidence to say how this came about, you know, whether she was purposely hiding it or whatever. What I also find interesting is that, to my understanding, you know, the way it works, the way they did this, if you talked about it earlier, and I just was thinking about it, Sybok was gone by the time Michael was there, but then Spock would have, you know, everyone always complained Spock didn't talk about Sybok. Well, he would have been really, really young when Sybok left. Mm-hmm. So it might even be someone he doesn't even really know enough to talk about. If my older brother left when I was 5, I wouldn't have any memories to talk about.
Yeah, you know, it's similar because I have a lot of steps and halves in my family. And, you know, one of my stepbrothers was only in my life for a little bitty time. And then my parents, well, not my parents, but my mom and the husband, that husband divorced. And so it's like, I don't really even consider him, you know, this step brother, even though he was, you know, they got divorced and my mother remarried and my father remarried. Like it's very similar to Sarek, you know, first wife, get a divorce, whatever, and then start a new family. That those siblings, and especially with that age gap, is not going to, you know, really remember or consider it a family.
Mm-hmm. See, that's it. Amy just ruined canon on this show. It's funny you bring that up, though, because I actually do have a half brother that I never met in person in my life. Mm-hmm. My father had a child in Vietnam when he was in Vietnam with a nurse that he was married to. And then her condition to get the divorce was that he had to disappear. And they told the kids that he died in Vietnam. And 6 months after my father died, the kid called my house looking for him. I say kid, he's 5 years older than I am, but and then long story short, stalked my sister to try and get information until I threatened to go find him. But
oh wow,
yeah, it was really bad. But to this day, I've only had like 2 phone conversations with the person in my whole life, and you know, it is what it is. But so yeah, so it could be a situation like that with Sybok that, you know, I don't know, maybe Amanda was in his life or not, but whatever. But Spock, I don't tell people about this half brother I don't know anything about. I don't have any reason to bring it up in normal conversation.
Yeah, that's very possible. I am thinking of what he said in Star Trek V, and perhaps he was kind of saying that from, I don't know, like a memory alpha type of thing, like just looking up his file, not being able to remember much specifics, because I don't know. But
that's good, because that's exactly how I would explain my half brother. Like, I don't want to get into a podcast, but there's certain things that I know about him, right, that would come from a file you would read.
Yeah.
And that's the only things I really know about the guy.
And I have nothing to offer because I'm an only child. My parents had their one and only marriage, so I don't have any half brothers or sisters.
So, you know, it was interesting, you know, reading over your outline and thinking about Michael, because we learn in season 2 the reason why her and Spock had a falling out.
Right.
I mean, it was pretty brutal.
Right.
She felt she was acting in her best interest, but, you know, was very mean and needed, in her opinion, to get away from the family. And I didn't even put it together till you put it on the outline that it's like, well, yeah, that happened when they were very young, but then she comes back to the house and continues living there. And because in season 1, we see that Sarek, you know, made the deal to have Spock go into the Vulcan expeditionary group and not Michael. And I thought that would have been very interesting to see, Michael and Spock going through that and then her returning to home, how difficult that would have been for those two.
Yeah. And Spock, he never even went into the Vulcan Science Academy. I went back and watched, in preparation, Journey to Babel. And it's mentioned on that episode that Spock didn't go to Vulcan Science Academy at all, and obviously didn't go into the Vulcan Expeditionary Group. He went straight into Starfleet. So, and certainly that caused a rift between Spock and Sarek, and I'm guessing that Spock doesn't even know why all of that went down, and is a big cause for that rift between them, and that seems to be a pattern with Sarek as well, because he did not reveal anything about why she was rejected until he's near death in Lethe, and they're going through that, whatever you would call that mind meld over space that was done there, but that then we see how it played out. But like here it is, Sarek, who made this awful choice, didn't handle it the right way, and made it worse by the fact that didn't tell any of this to Spock either, obviously. And Spock just said, well, I'm doing this. And Sarek didn't really, probably one of those parents that, like, for example, this happens today where the parents are planning for the kid to go into medical school or law school, and instead he wants to go be an actor or something, and how you hear stories of that where the family's estranged because of that. And it sounds like it was a similar kind of thing with Sarek. He just, I don't know, but we don't know if, one thing is clear. Those two never melded, and that's of course mentioned in TNG Unification, that they never melded. So, and I don't think that Spock knows that Michael and Sarek had not only a mind meld, but Sarek shared his Katra together. There was one point where I think it might have been in if memory serves, where Michael looked like she was about to tell him that you're wrong about Sarek, but she didn't. And I think that would have been the moment where she would have told him that they shared his Katra, but he didn't. And, I wonder, Spock may have, if he had a mind meld with Michael, eventually his reactions, or like his relationship with Sarek, may have repaired itself a lot sooner than it actually did, But yeah, there's all sorts of interesting dynamics there that I didn't even realize were there, and it's one of those things. It's like, I wouldn't have designed it this way, but now that we have it, I think that they've weaved this interesting story that just adds so much dimension to that family that I never realized.
Right. It's interesting how you are coming at it through like Sarek's experimental procedures on his children. It's a bit Machiavellian for me. I'm not sure if I'm buying into it. I can definitely see the differences that he has with each child. Mm-hmm. And not being a parent myself, I can only assume that parents do have different parenting styles depending on the child, because each child is so drastically different, whether they are your full or a step, or, so I totally respect that you're coming at it. I think I still have a not so intentional on Sarek's part That's just my opinion. Patrick, what do you think?
So as a father of 2 children, I can tell you are absolutely correct that you have to parent different. I mean, you still have to be fair. There's certain things that have to stay the same, but you can't react and act with this. The only way to really screw up is to try and treat each child like they're the same. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because there are different needs. My daughter is better at certain things than my son, and vice versa. And I mean, just the things they do. However, you will learn that the younger child will, if they're close in age, like mine are 3, maybe 5, maybe even 6 years apart. Mine are 3, but up to that range, like you'll find that the younger one will start to copy a lot of the older one often, and that's good and bad traits they will very easily copy. But your reactions to them sometimes have to be slightly different because you're not going to get a response the same way from the child if you just try and do the same thing over and over again. And so that's definitely true, but treating every child the same could end up with all 3 of these responses from 3 different children. The problem could be that Sarek didn't change the way he tried to parent at all, and which caused these three to be so different in the end.
Right.
And sort of left it up to Amanda to, cope with the children differently because Sarek was so, and I almost sort of buy that with the logical, like everything is logical. Therefore, here is a action that the child did, and here's the response, and that's just logical.
You even hear that with some of Sarek's responses, like when I think in the first episode of like Brother of second season, where Michael asks Sarek, why do you think he didn't come over to Discovery? And Sarek immediately has an answer. Well, he's obviously focused all his efforts on repairing the Enterprise. Like that's just the answer. It's not like, oh, here's one answer. No, this is the answer based on, all that we know. But of course, he's way off, not even close to being what's actually going on. But yeah, I wonder if Sarek, the point about him maybe trying to raise them the same, I hadn't thought of it in that way, but it does. I do see some merit there. But it's all interesting how all 3 of these have this kind of like human-Vulcan connection. Yeah. And how, like, that's why I'm thinking of like Sarek trying to mold the perfect Vulcan somehow, and how obviously the results didn't end up the way that he wanted them to. But certainly, at least with Michael and Spock, ended up with 2 exceptional people. And Sybok, I think, mentioned in Star Trek V how he went away, and so he was probably a total failure, I guess. But the other 2 obviously succeeded, just not in the way that Sarek envisioned.
Yeah, but we don't even know. I mean, I get it. You say that he went away, but he went away under Vulcan rules and Vulcan considerations. So it's not necessarily that he was a complete. I mean, they're probably trying to tell you he was a complete failure, but that may not be true. He just may have failed in the Vulcan way and strived at something else that they don't deem to matter. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
that's how I see it. Yeah,
yeah. He maybe failed is not the right way to put it. He abandoned the Vulcan way and went off on his own. So maybe not failure, but essentially he rejected all of that and kind of went on his own course.
I can completely relate to that. As I look at growing up, being raised under a very devout religion, and then shunning my upbringing, and, sort of get that. I feel like some of my family members are, wow, she's fallen, and, that judgment of, well, she hasn't followed the right path and stuff like that. So I don't know if failure is the right word, but I think rejection is better.
Yeah, I think rejection is better.
I can't speak to it. I'm fourth generation in my professional field, so I follow exactly what my family does.
You are a success, not a failure,
exactly.
Patrick.
Hey, that's the first time that's been said ever.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more because we did spend some time on Sybok and Spock. So let's talk about Michael. And you have an interesting question, like, how does Michael end up with Sarek and Amanda after the attack?
Okay.
So I really want to, see what the answer is because I'm a little unsure myself. So answers to that question?
The one thing that is mentioned in Brother is that Sarek says it's our responsibility when it comes to Michael. And I wonder why that is. Like, was he involved in getting them stationed at Daktari Alpha? Like, we know that they were there because of Section 31 and the whole Red Angel, time suit or whatever. But how was he involved, and why is that his responsibility? That's what. Didn't the Burnhams have any other family that would have? We don't know that, and I was still very curious about that. It is also mentioned that Michael wanted to go back home to Earth, but obviously never did with Amanda, although she says that she was going to take her someday. But so where was the rest of the Burnham family after they died, supposedly?
Yeah, and why would Sarek and Amanda feel that having her be raised with them would be better than any other human back on Earth?
Right.
That's a strong opinion to have, to remove a child from Earth and her entire culture.
Maybe it has something to do with Michael's abilities. Clearly, she had great, abilities as a child, and maybe it was thought that that Sarek, raising her on Vulcan could kind of hone those mental abilities, those scholastic abilities, and put them to good use or something. I don't know.
Patrick, what do you think?
I just saw this way more simplistically, like the fact that he's just that arrogant. He thinks he's the only one who can do it. I don't really know why he's so involved to feel that way, but he's obviously involved with her in some way, or the family in some way. So I felt it was just an arrogance issue that, well, I'm the only one good enough to do this.
Yeah.
That's basically my take on it.
I mean, when you look at it that way, then that goes back to, well, yeah, maybe Sarek was performing these experiments, and now here's this new fresh blood, if you will, and 100% human to sort of finish out that trilogy of 100%, 50-50.
Or possibly he felt that he could take her on as a student and a family member and prove that humans are worthy to be here and in defense of his wife. Because people were against their marriage. I mean,
absolutely
they're negative to the Vulcans. So he could use this as, look what I did with a human. Look at how Vulcan they are.
Yeah, there clearly is some prejudice there on Vulcan with humans. We saw that in Enterprise, and I know, Patrick, I know you've dealt with this a lot on your other show, or 5, that how they characterize the Vulcans, and I think there is a line that we see between Enterprise and Discovery with that kind of prejudice that Vulcans seem to have with humans and their emotion, and we clearly see this in Lethe, the way that the director of the Vulcan Expeditionary Group reacts in what I would clearly define as a very racist attitude. And I think that that this prejudice is just something that is seen, and Amanda even questions Sarek over his own prejudice. Like, she asks him if he would have ever, moved to Earth for her. And, clearly based on the reaction, Sarek would have answered no. He doesn't answer no. He didn't answer, but it's pretty clear that he wouldn't have. It's interesting. Again, a lot of people were very opposed to the way that the Vulcans were painted in Enterprise, and I certainly agreed at the time. But now I see all this nuance there that I didn't see before, and eventually, although you could even argue that they didn't completely get over it because we have that captain in Deep Space Nine that challenged Cisco to baseball, and he obviously had some issues with Cisco and humans, and thought the superiority of the Vulcans over the humans. So maybe it never goes away.
I feel that they've always felt superior, even you're right. And this is not Warp 5, but we did do an episode about that specific topic, and yes, they're different Vulcans. There's a change between Enterprise and Discovery, who's leading the Vulcans. However, you see their feelings on humans throughout all of the shows, and they've always been a little bit nose up towards humans. No matter how great our relationship is, they've always felt better than us, and that's always been shown to us in just the fact that they're so logical, and that's the only thing that matters. Like, they're not open to the idea, really, to the idea of, emotions and other things, because, well, it screwed up their society so bad that it can't possibly be good for anyone else.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. They look down because of the fact that humans don't try to control their emotions, and they can't fathom the idea that it hasn't caused the collapse of humanity. I mean, it's come close, certainly, we've had the world wars and, terrorism and all the things that has happened, but if anything, that just tied people more together. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, so to speak. So, yeah, it is funny that how Vulcans seem to just put their nose up to humans. Yet, they seem to. I'm just saying they do that. Yet they seem to value our ability to kind of inspire, I think, and lead, because you don't see Vulcans leading the Federation. It's I know in Star Trek 6, it's Homo sapiens only club gets brought up by the Klingons, but it is largely kind of a human led, at least at this point, it seems like a human led Federation, and the Vulcans are just kind of, science officers, so to speak.
Yeah, and part of that is because the humans are writing the story, right? But also, to be a politician, you need to be able to play on emotions. You just do. That's a fact. Whether you're the politician I love or I hate, you're playing one way or another. You're playing on someone's emotions, and it's ironic that part of the commentary about Vulcans here is that they're so logical they don't allow their emotions to play into it, but they end up at the same result.
Right.
They end up with a racist result, which is where if you don't check your emotions, at some point you will end up there. You'll hate something irrationally. Right. And that's what they're doing, trying to go the other way. But so obviously the commentary somewhere in the middle is correct.
Right.
But Sarek is he doesn't have an outward racism towards humans, because obviously he married one and other things like that, but there's still biases there.
Biases, yeah.
And they're very strong with him because he doesn't like the human emotion. He doesn't want his family members to have it, and he doesn't like that his wife, puts that on the kids and stuff. So it's a weird. It's not a healthy relationship,
right? And yet he does acknowledge his own emotions from time to time. Like when he says he doesn't want to lose both his children, on the same day. That kind of thing. So clearly he reluctantly acknowledges the emotions that he has. And, later, of course, we see how deep they are, later chronologically in the episode of TNG Sarek, which I still say was one of the great moments of Patrick Stewart and his role of Picard.
Agreed. So I have a question for you, because I was just thinking about, when I think about especially Spock and Sarek and Amanda, I can't help but think about the Kelvin timeline, especially in Star Trek 09, and how that influences and colors my perception. I know it's an alternate timeline. I totally get that. But I feel that it is so close that I can still, in my mind, relate them together. And we see and learn so much about Amanda and Spock's feelings specifically towards her, and how we see Sarek sort of saying, admitting that he loves Amanda, and, and just sort of how Spock sort of grew up in those early formative years. Do you guys think about the Kelvin timeline when you're looking at Sarek and Amanda, Patrick?
So I haven't with them. I do with these kinds of issues, though.
Mm-hmm.
Because, they're different timelines. However, everyone treats them like the timeline split 500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't. They just recently split, which means everything up to that moment is identical.
Right.
So Sarek's emotions towards Amanda would be the same in both timelines 20 days, 100 days, 2 years after the fact.
Right.
For the most part. There could be a major issue that pops up in one of the other timelines that would change it. But they in reality, they shouldn't be that far apart.
Yeah.
In fact, the people who say they have nothing to do with each other are also the same people who go, well, he's 6 months too old in this one, and that shouldn't change because everything should be the same. Like, I feel that when people just act like that thing doesn't exist at all, it's because they just don't like the Kelvin timeline, and that's fine if you don't. But you can definitely use it as reference points for larger issues, not specific things that happened in the timeline, but larger issues.
I agree.
That go back farther.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think if you do the math, I think, sorry, Amy, that's a pun intended, I guess.
Yeah.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Kelvin incident happens in 2233. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe the incident at Doctari Alpha happens in 2236. So, you could argue that Burnham was not in Spock's life in the Kelvin timeline, but I haven't done exhaustive research on this, so I could have my years wrong. But I'm pretty sure that they were both born before the Kelvin incident. But I believe if you go back, I know that in Perpetual Infinity, it's mentioned that for 20 years she thought that her mother was dead, and of course, turns out that she wasn't dead. So I think that would put that at about 2236 or 2237. So just assuming there's not a lot of rounding going on. Anyway, the point.
Yeah, but I think what Patrick's saying is like just that bigger idea, bigger picture of, family dynamics, that it's not going to be that different.
I would imagine it wouldn't be that different unless, and you could argue that maybe Michael would have joined that family in that timeline as well. We don't know, but we do see like a different Spock in that timeline, a little more, I would say a little more emotional, but I don't know. It's hard to tell anymore with the years and all of that. Like, I think where we are in Discovery is around the same time frame as in the first Kelvin movie. I think it's around 2257, but I don't know. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm not that big on dates. It's just, this was before TOS, this is after, so
yeah,
it's all good to me.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to get to our final thoughts. So what have we learned about Sarek and Amanda's family with doing this research? Brian, you're our guest, so why don't you go first?
Well, it shows me, in looking at this, like I say, prior to Discovery, I didn't really give a lot of thought to how that family was, what it was like growing up in that family. But as a result of putting Michael in, designing a story where she is his foster sister and kind of defining more things about Spock, and, like a lot of people had reservations about bringing Spock into Discovery, but for me, it worked so well. I think Ethan Peck did a wonderful job, and it also really defined much better, I think, in season 2, Michael as a character, and we got to see a lot more dimensions. And I mentioned, I think, on my recent roundtable, how a lot of people in the first season criticized the character of Michael Burnham because she was too cold, too not emotional at all, very mechanical. And now a lot of the same people criticize her for being too emotional, crying too much, and all of that. It's not lost on me that we see that, but the fact that it added so much more dimension to Spock as well, I think, was really interesting. And of course, Sarek, and it looks going forward, we're not going to see